In the summer of 2018, a devoted father and his teenage daughter vanished while riding horseback through the rolling plains of Wyoming. Authorities quickly labeled it a tragic accident, suggesting they were swept away by the river's unpredictable currents. But no horses, no gear, not even tracks were ever recovered. 5 silent years passed, with no answers, until ranchers stumbled upon something shocking: a horse's weathered bridle dangling from a cottonwood tree beside a shallow creek, and clutched within its tangled leather straps was a child's pink backpack, eerily intact. The morning broke with the kind of stillness only Wyoming can conjure, a silence that seems to stretch endlessly across the plains, broken only by the low murmur of wind through cottonwoods. By noon, that silence would become something far more sinister. On this day, beneath a wide dome of blue sky, a father and daughter saddled up for what should have been an ordinary ride into the wild. Instead, it became the last time anyone ever saw them alive. Michael Hanlon was a man of quiet strength, the sort of father who rarely raised his voice but carried authority in his presence. Years of ranch life had carved lines of resilience into his face, his hands roughened from rope and rein. To his teenage daughter, Emily, he was both protector and playmate. At 16, she was wide-eyed but stubborn, her laugh infectious, her curiosity always pulling her toward the unknown. Riding with him was their ritual, an unspoken bond forged on dusty trails and whispering meadows. That morning, Emily's mother, Laura, leaned against the kitchen counter, watching them prepare. "Don't be late for dinner," she teased, the smell of coffee still clinging to her robe. "We won't," Michael said, fastening the saddle with a firm tug. His voice was steady, reassuring. Emily rolled her eyes but smiled, brushing her hair back beneath a faded ball cap. "We'll be back before you know it." Laura's reply carried a faint tremor. "You'd better." The landscape they rode into was breathtaking in its harshness. Rolling plains spread out in golden waves, dotted with sagebrush and framed by distant snow-capped peaks. The air smelled of dust and sun-warmed grass. Horses' hooves thudded rhythmically against the earth, a sound that seemed to sync with Emily's laughter as she urged her mare forward. Locals later remembered seeing them that day. A father steady in the saddle, his daughter tilting her head back in carefree joy, hair streaming in the breeze. At the general store, an old ranch hand saw them pass by. They looked like they were heading toward the river, he recalled, his eyes narrowing. Didn't seem in no hurry, just happy. Another neighbor remembered Michael tipping his hat in greeting, Emily waving before disappearing beyond the ridge. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the land. The 2 riders had vanished into that horizon, swallowed by wilderness. The hours slipped by. Dinner came and went. Laura stood on the porch as dusk gathered, the screen door creaking behind her, eyes scanning the empty trail for silhouettes that never appeared. Night settled in, the wind colder now, carrying with it a gnawing unease. Their horses had not returned. Their voices did not echo across the fields. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed father and daughter whole. And by the time the stars took the sky, it was clear Michael and Emily were gone. The news spread quickly across the valley. Michael and Emily had not come home. By dawn the next morning, the once peaceful Wyoming town buzzed with unease. The sheriff's office phones rang without pause. Neighbors gathered in clusters along dirt roads, and ranchers mounted their own horses, scanning the horizon. Something was wrong. Out here, men and their horses always came back. Sheriff Dalton, a weathered man with a trimmed mustache and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, took the call from Laura Hanlon just before midnight. Her voice was thin, shaking. "They should have been home by now. Something's happened, Sheriff." "I know it." Dalton tried to reassure her, but unease settled into his gut. At sunrise he was already out at the trailhead, boots sinking into damp soil from the night's dew. By mid-morning, a full search was underway. Pickup trucks rattled down gravel roads, trailers hauling horses to join the effort. Neighbors formed lines across fields, their shouts echoing into the emptiness. Helicopters circled overhead, the whir of blades cutting through the still air. Dogs were brought in, their handlers urging them forward with clipped commands. The official word from the sheriff's office was cautious but confident. Michael and Emily must have had an accident at the river. It was the only explanation that made sense. The North Platte was known to swell without warning, its currents deceptive, stronger than they looked. The theory spread through town like wildfire. 2 riders swept away in a tragic mishap. But Laura refused to accept it. Standing before reporters outside her home, her face pale and drawn, she shook her head. No. Michael knew that river better than anyone. He taught our daughter how to cross safely. He wouldn't have risked it, not with her, not ever. Her words hung heavy in the air, carried on the wind to the waiting microphones. The searchers pressed harder, combing riverbanks and canyons, dragging sections of water, hours stretched into days. Yet no tracks marked the mud, no splintered wood hinted at broken gear, no horses were found wandering loose across the plains. The absence of evidence became its own chilling presence. A rancher named Carl, after a long day in the saddle, muttered to another searcher, "If they went into that river, we'd have found something by now. A boot, a rein, something." His words reflected what many were beginning to think, but didn't dare to say aloud. The river theory faltered with every fruitless hour. Still, the sheriff clung to it, repeating it to anxious townsfolk, to reporters, even to himself. People needed an answer, and the river was the easiest one. One night, Laura stood alone at the edge of the search camp, staring at the endless dark stretching across the plains. Her hands trembled as she whispered to a deputy, "It feels like they vanished into the air." The deputy had no answer, just silence, broken only by the distant croak of frogs and the low rush of wind through the grass. By the 4th day, morale began to fracture. Searchers returned sunburned, blistered, their faces etched with frustration. Dogs lay panting, their noses raw from endless sniffing. Helicopters burned through fuel with no reward, and still there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no trace of where 2 riders had gone. It was as if the land itself had erased them. When Sheriff Dalton called a meeting to summarize the situation, he spoke slowly, as though weighing each word. "We've scoured every inch of terrain. Nothing fits. No tracks, no debris, no horses. It doesn't add up." His deputies exchanged uneasy glances. The ranchers shifted in their seats, murmuring. The official accident theory hung in the air like smoke, but with every passing moment it seemed thinner, less believable. For all their searching, they had no answers. And by the time the sun set that evening, casting the plains in a fiery glow, the investigators stood baffled, staring into the vast emptiness as if it might finally yield its secret. The land gave them nothing, only silence. The 5th morning broke with an eerie stillness. Dew clung to the grass, and the prairies stretched out in pale gold, yet there was no sense of peace in the air, only tension, like the land itself was holding its breath. By now, searchers had combed nearly every obvious trail, but Michael and Emily remained missing, their absence gnawing at everyone's nerves. The wilderness had swallowed them whole, and no one could explain. Helicopters thundered overhead, their blades chopping the sky in steady rhythm. Below, searchers trudged through brush, their boots sinking into soft earth, their eyes scanning for broken branches, torn fabric, or hoof prints. Dogs strained at their leashes, noses down, barking sharply when they thought they caught a scent, only to fall silent moments later. The terrain was vast and merciless. Rolling plains gave way to thickets of scrub oak and deep gullies carved by centuries of rain. The river wound like a silver serpent, its surface deceptively calm, masking currents strong enough to pull down a horse. Searchers moved along its banks, calling out the names, Michael, Emily, their voices echoing back at them in hollow repetition. Sheriff Dalton dismounted his horse at a ridge, looking down at the search grid below. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered to his deputy, "It's like they just lifted off the earth." The younger man said nothing, only shifted uneasily in his saddle. The days blurred together in punishing heat. Volunteers trudged for miles, their canteens growing lighter with every step. At night, campfires flickered across the valley, weary men and women slumping into folding chairs, their faces illuminated by orange glow. Conversations were hushed, broken by the occasional frustrated outburst. "I've been riding these lands 40 years, said rancher Carl, his voice raw. "You lose cattle, you find tracks. You lose men, you find tracks too. But this is different. It's wrong." Others nodded, but no one had an explanation. Laura remained a fixture at the command post. Her face grew paler with each passing day, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. She refused to leave, gripping Michael's worn leather jacket draped over her lap. Deputies urged her to rest, but she shook her head. "I'll rest when they're home." One evening she cornered Dalton. "You're not looking in the right places," she insisted, her voice sharp. "Check the canyons, the old logging trails. Michael would have known the safe routes. If they're not there, then someone took them." Dalton hesitated, glancing at his men before replying. "Laura, there's no sign of foul play." Her reply was immediate, icy. "There's no sign of anything. That should scare you more." The FBI briefly joined the effort, bringing advanced equipment, thermal imaging, and drones. Searchers hoped technology might succeed where human eyes had failed. But even with the mechanical buzz of drones sweeping the skies, the land yielded nothing. No heat signatures, no trails. The agents left within days, their departure marked by a growing sense of abandonment among locals. For Laura, the withdrawal was unbearable. She broke down, sobbing into her hands, outside her home, her neighbors standing silently around her. "They've given up," she whispered. "Everyone's given up but me." The longer the search dragged on, the stranger it seemed. Horses, by nature, returned when separated from riders. Saddles, reins, or even a stray glove should have surfaced. Yet the wilderness offered only silence, not a trace of Emily's bright-colored jacket, not a scrap of Michael's gear. The volunteers grew restless. Some whispered about hidden sinkholes, others about predators dragging them off. But these explanations rang hollow. Sinkholes left disturbed ground. Predators left trails, remains. Here there was nothing. One night, as a storm brewed on the horizon, lightning flashing across the ridgeline, Laura sat outside the search tent, rain lashed down in sheets, soaking her hair and clothes. She didn't move. When a deputy tried to coax her inside, she said softly, almost to herself, "I can still feel her. Emily's out there. I know it." The deputy, unnerved, simply placed a blanket over her shoulders. By the 10th day, exhaustion carved deep lines into every face. Ranchers slumped against fence posts, deputies leaned against their trucks, heads in their hands, even the dogs moved sluggishly, their tongues lolling. Sheriff Dalton finally gathered the core team, speaking words he dreaded. "We've done everything we can. There's nothing more to find." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Laura rose to her feet, trembling but resolute. Her voice cut through the gloom. "No. You're wrong. Something happened to them. And until you admit that, you'll never find them." Her words unsettled even the toughest ranch hands, because deep down, many already knew she was right. That night, as the searchlights flickered off one by one, the plains stretched into darkness, silent and unyielding. Michael and Emily had not simply vanished into wilderness. The land had swallowed them whole, without a trace, without a witness, without mercy. And for the first time, even the sheriff was forced to admit, something about this disappearance defied reason. The house had grown too quiet. Every tick of the old clock in the kitchen hammered Laura Hanlon's nerves, each second another reminder that Michael and Emily were gone. The search parties had thinned. The helicopters had left. Neighbors returned to their routines, their cattle, their chores. But Laura refused to move on. For her, the silence wasn't closure, it was a wound that would never heal. At first, she haunted the sheriff's office daily, her voice raw, pleading, "You can't stop. They're still out there. You don't just vanish." Sheriff Dalton's weary eyes met hers, but his tone was resigned. "Laura, we've looked longer than most cases get. The land gave us nothing." She slammed her hand on the desk. "Then you're not listening to the land." Dalton had no answer. At night, she walked the riverbanks with a flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the reeds. The water murmured beside her, dark and impenetrable. She whispered her daughter's name into the current, "Emily, as if the river might answer, but only the frogs replied, croaking in the distance, their calls mocking her solitude. Inside the house, Emily's room remained untouched. The bedspread still rumpled from that last morning. A hairbrush tangled with blonde strands left on the dresser. Laura sat on the edge of the bed some nights, clutching a stuffed horse Emily had outgrown but never let go of. "I promised her you'd always keep her safe," she whispered into the empty room. "You wouldn't let her down." Flashbacks intruded. She saw Michael teaching Emily to ride when she was just 7. His steady hands on the reins, her laughter bubbling as the pony trotted awkwardly. She remembered summer nights, the three of them on the porch, watching storms roll in, Michael's arm draped protectively around them both. Those memories weren't comfort now, they were daggers. Friends urged her to accept the accident theory. "Maybe it's kinder that way," one neighbor said softly. Laura's face hardened. "Kinder? My husband knew those trails. He taught men half his age how to ride this land." "You think he didn't know a river?" "No, something else happened, and you all want to pretend it didn't." The community began to move on. Ranchers grew quieter when she entered the diner, conversation stalling before shifting to other topics. Parents pulled their children close, as though tragedy might be contagious, but Laura's obsession grew only sharper. She pinned maps to her living room wall. Drawing circles, marking trails, she cornered old ranch hands for stories about caves and abandoned cabins. She wrote letters to state police, to federal agents, begging them to reopen the case. Most replies were polite refusals, some never replied at all. Still, she pressed forward. At a town hall meeting, 2 months after the disappearance, she stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. "They are out there. Someone knows what happened. And if you think time will silence me, you're wrong." The room was silent, her neighbors staring at her with a mix of pity and unease. No one argued, no one comforted her either. Then, one autumn evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Laura received a call. The voice on the other end was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "I saw them," the caller whispered. Laura froze, gripping the receiver. "Saw who?" "Your husband. Your girl." Not long after they left that day. They weren't alone. Before she could ask another question, the line went dead. Her hand trembled as she lowered the phone. For the first time in months, a new kind of fear slid beneath her grief. If the caller was telling the truth, then Michael and Emily hadn't simply vanished into the wilderness. Someone had been there with them. The rumor spread through the valley like wildfire. A man had seen them, Michael and Emily, alive, days after they'd been declared lost. It was a whisper of hope, but one tainted with dread. Because if the sighting was real, then their disappearance was no accident. It was something dark. The sheriff's office sprang back into motion. Deputies combed through reports, chasing threads of information across counties. A trucker claimed he saw a man and teenage girl riding near a feed store in Casper. A clerk swore a girl with blonde hair and a pink backpack stopped in for candy. Each lead sparked fresh urgency, but each dissolved under scrutiny. Grainy CCTV footage revealed only strangers. Families on road trips, ranchers passing through, none were the Hanlon. Still, Laura clung to every report. At the sheriff's desk, she leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You can't ignore these. Somebody saw them. If they were alive then, they could still be alive now." Dalton's voice was firm but tired. "Laura, we checked. The girl on the tape isn't Emily. The man with her isn't Michael." Her response was a whisper of defiance. "Then where are they?" Theories sprouted like weeds. Some whispered of abduction, that a stranger had followed them into the plains. Others spoke of human trafficking rings that had begun to reach even remote towns. In diners and bars, voices lowered when her name came up, muttering about foul play. "Could have been someone passing through," one rancher said over a beer. "This land hides more than cattle." Another leaned in, lowering his voice further. "Or maybe it was someone closer. Folks don't just vanish without someone helping it along." The insinuation chilled those listening, but no one spoke out loud what everyone feared. If the Hanlons had been taken, the culprit might walk among them still. Weeks passed, searchers pulled back, investigators shuffled paperwork, and silence returned to the valley. But the shadows lengthened. One afternoon, ranch hands driving cattle stumbled upon a lone horse wandering near the foothills. Its coat was matted, ribs showing, reins trailing in the dirt. For a moment, hope surged. It had to be Michael's or Emily's. Deputies hurried to the scene, Laura following close behind. Her breath caught when she saw the animal. But as she stepped closer, despair struck. The horse was unfamiliar, marked with a brand belonging to a ranch 40 miles north, a straggler. Nothing more. Laura's sob echoed across the plains. Still, unsettling fragments continued to surface. A boot print in dry mud too fresh to be weeks old. A scrap of fabric snagged on barbed wire, pale enough to resemble Emily's jacket. Each discovery raised the same desperate question. Were these signs of survival, or remnants planted to mislead? Late one night, sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by maps and newspaper clippings, Laura whispered to herself, "They're out there, someone knows." Her hands shook as she traced her finger across the trails Michael loved. She imagined him leading Emily, their horses steady, until a shadow emerged from the trees. The thought made her stomach turn. The sheriff, too, began to feel the weight of contradiction. "We've got too much nothing," he told his deputy one evening. "If it were an accident, we'd have bodies. If it were foul play, we'd have signs. But we got neither." The deputy hesitated before replying, "Maybe that's the sign." Dalton didn't respond. The community grew restless. Fear crept into conversations at church, at the feed store, at school pickup lines. Parents told their children not to ride alone. Locks clicked on doors that had stayed open for decades. Yet the mystery deepened with silence. No ransom note, no demands, no bodies, just shadows where Michael and Emily had once been. On a cold November morning, Laura woke to frost on the windows, her breath misting in the air. She walked to the porch, clutching her coat tight, eyes scanning the horizon the way she had every day since that summer. The world was quiet, too quiet. And in that quiet, the truth pressed heavier than ever. If her family had been taken, then someone had walked them away from the trail, past the searchers, past the eyes of neighbors, and left no trace. The idea was unbearable, but it was the only one that made sense. The Wyoming plains hold memories in their silence. They cradle bones beneath layers of dust, preserve wagon ruts from a century past, and echo the cries of coyotes across canyons where time itself feels stalled. For months after Michael and Emily's disappearance, the land seemed determined to give nothing back. But by the winter's thaw, searchers began to realize if answers existed at all, they would not come from men. They would come from the land itself. Spring brought a second wave of searching. Snowmelt fed the rivers, turning calm currents into churning ribbons of white foam. Ranchers rode along swollen banks, mud splattering their boots, scanning for debris. Deputies carried poles to prod the earth for sinkholes, their breath visible in the cold morning air. One searcher paused by a stand of willows, the water lapping against their roots. "You'd think the land would give us something," he muttered, bending to sift through driftwood. His partner shook his head. "It remembers, just doesn't mean it's ready to share." That became the whispered refrain. The land remembers. The terrain offered more questions than answers. In one canyon, a dog alerted frantically near a scatter of bones. Volunteers rushed forward, hearts hammering, only to discover the remains of a deer long dead. Relief mixed with fresh despair. Another time, divers combing a deep bend in the river found tangled logs that looked like twisted limbs in the murky water. When pulled up, they were nothing but sodden timber. Each false discovery tore open wounds anew. For Laura, these almost finds were torture. She insisted on attending many of the searches, standing at the periphery with arms crossed, eyes sharp. When volunteers returned shaking their heads, she would whisper, "Keep looking. You're not finished." Some avoided her gaze, embarrassed by their own fatigue. Others admitted privately that her determination frightened them more than the emptiness of the land. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the ridges, a deputy approached Laura gently. "We found boot prints today," he told her. Her breath, but then he hesitated. They led nowhere, just stopped in the dust. Laura stared at him, her voice low and cold. Nothing just stops. Someone stopped them. Even among seasoned ranchers, the search was wearing thin. Carl, the grizzled old hand who had scoured the plains since day one, sat by a campfire shaking his head. "I've tracked strays, rustlers, even men hiding from the law," he said, voice rough with smoke. "Always found something. This," he waved at the darkness pressing against the firelight, "this is different, like the land's covering for whoever did it." The younger men shifted uneasily, listening to the fire crackle. No one argued. As weeks turned to months, the search transformed into ritual. Ranchers rode trails more out of duty than belief. Deputies combed through gullies with faces hardened by futility. Yet sometimes the land teased them with signs, half-clues, fragments that sparked more unease than comfort. A single bootprint hardened into clay. A piece of leather weathered by sun and rain, torn too ragged to identify, skeletal remains buried in shale, only to prove animal upon examination. Each fragment carried with it a sickening hope, followed by crushing disappointment. One memory haunted a young volunteer named Tyler. He had been searching a low canyon when he spotted what looked like a child's jacket wedged beneath a rock. His pulse spiked as he scrambled toward it, mud clinging to his boots. When he yanked it free, it turned out to be nothing more than a sun-bleached tarp. "I heard her name in my head," he confessed later to another searcher, "like she was calling out. And when it wasn't her, it felt like the ground was laughing at me." Laura began to walk the trails alone. Deputies begged her not to, fearing the danger of a woman wandering into unforgiving terrain, but she refused. With each step, she whispered prayers, half to God, half to the earth itself. "Give them back to me," she murmured to the wind. "Give them back." One night, after hours of wandering, she returned with dirt caked beneath her nails. When a neighbor asked what she'd been doing, she answered simply, "Digging." The word unsettled him deeply. By late summer, even Sheriff Dalton, who prided himself on logic, admitted aloud what others had whispered. "This isn't just a disappearance. It's something else, and the land's not letting go of its secret." His deputies exchanged uneasy glances, because if the land was keeping secrets, it meant someone had buried them there. The search waned, but the memory lingered. Trails grew over with weeds. Markers faded under the sun. Yet Laura's presence remained constant. She visited the last known trailhead weekly, laying fresh flowers at the signpost. Locals driving past would see her standing there, motionless, as if waiting for Michael and Emily to ride back into sight. And then, one evening, as the wind howled across the valley, a new whisper reached her. A ranch hand returned from the far edge of the property, pale and shaken. "I found something," he told the sheriff. "Something the land finally gave up." 5 years. That's how long the Wyoming plains carried the secret. 5 winters of snowdrifts, burying trails, 5 summers of parched wind, scouring the earth clean. Seasons changed. Cattle were born and sold. Families moved on. But the mystery of Michael and Emily Hanlon remained like a thorn lodged in the valley's skin. Time dulled the sharp edges of grief for most, but for Laura, each day stretched longer, sharper, heavier. The silence did not soften, it only deepened. In the months after the official search ended, the Hanlon ranch grew quieter. The barn doors sagged on their hinges, fences went unmended. Where once Michael's strong hands had fixed everything, now only emptiness lingered. Emily's room remained untouched, a shrine to a girl who had vanished into the horizon. The smell of lavender still clung faintly to her pillows. Laura drifted through the house like a shadow. She no longer cooked full meals, no longer played the radio. The phone rang less and less as neighbors stopped checking in. Uncomfortable with her relentless refusal to move forward, they whispered she was stuck, unable to let go, but for Laura, letting go was betrayal. At night she sat by the window, watching the dark stretch across the plains. Coyotes cried in the distance, their howls threading through the silence like warnings. She would whisper into the blackness, "Where are you? Where are you?" The same words, over and over, until dawn. The community changed in subtle ways. At the diner, conversation still dropped when Laura entered. At church, parishioners offered polite nods but no comfort. Her determination unsettled them. It was easier to believe in an accident than to accept the possibility of something sinister. Sheriff Dalton, too, had aged. The case had carved lines into his face, turned his hair silver. Though he no longer spoke publicly about it, his deputies caught him staring at the case file late at night. One finally asked, "You think we missed something?" Dalton exhaled, tapping ash from his cigarette. "I think we missed everything." Every year on the anniversary, Laura walked to the trailhead where Michael and Emily had last been seen. She laid flowers at the signpost, their colors bright against the weathered wood. She would stand there for hours, eyes scanning the ridge, as though expecting riders to crest the horizon. Passers-by sometimes slowed their trucks to watch, unsettled by the sight of a lone woman waiting for ghosts. A neighbor once asked gently, "Doesn't it hurt too much?" Laura's answer was simple: "It hurts more not to come." By the third year, rumors began to fade into legend. Newcomers to the valley heard the story in fragments: a father and daughter swallowed by the land. Some said the river claimed them. Others whispered of foul play, a stranger passing through. Children dared each other to ride near the riverbank at dusk, telling ghost stories about Michael and Emily's spirits wandering the plains. But for those who had known them, the story was no campfire tale. It was an open wound. The land itself seemed complicit in the silence. Trails eroded, hoofprints vanished, and nature reclaimed the places searchers had once scoured. Willows grew thick along the river, concealing its banks. Coyotes and hawks thrived, predators filling the void where answers should have been. The wilderness gave no sign it had ever held two riders who vanished without a trace. Still, Laura held her vigil. Every night she lit a lantern in the window, casting a pool of gold into the darkness. "So they can find their way home," she told herself, even as neighbors whispered it was madness. By the 5th year, even Dalton avoided driving past the Hanlon ranch. The sight of the peeling paint, the sagging fences, and Laura's gaunt figure standing on the porch made him feel a guilt he couldn't name. The case haunted him, gnawed at him, yet remained unsolvable. One evening he confided to a deputy, "It's like the earth erased them, wiped them clean off the map." The deputy shifted uneasily. "Or like someone didn't want them found." The sheriff didn't answer. And then, in the summer of the 5th year, silence broke. Ranchers riding the far edges of their property stumbled across something strange in a dry creek bed. A weathered bridle, tangled in the branches of a cottonwood, leather straps cracked from sun exposure, but still intact. Dangling from the bridle was a faded object that froze them in their tracks, a small pink backpack, impossibly well preserved after half a decade in the wild. One of the men whispered, his voice hoarse, "This wasn't washed here. Somebody put it here." The land, after 5 years of silence, had finally remembered. The July sun burned white across the Wyoming plains, baking the earth until even the wind felt scorched. It was on such a blistering afternoon that two ranchers, brothers, seasoned by decades of cattle drives, rode out to check their herd along a remote creek bed. The land was parched, cracked like old leather, the cottonwoods throwing thin shadows over the dust. Their horses plodded wearily, hooves stirring clouds that clung in the air. Nothing about the day seemed extraordinary until they saw it. At first it looked like a tangle of debris snagged in the branches of a low cottonwood. The elder brother nudged his horse closer, squinting beneath the glare. The leather straps hung limp, swaying gently in the breeze. He frowned, sliding from the saddle, boots crunching in the dry creek bed. "Looks like a bridle," he muttered, voice low. The younger brother joined him, dismounting slowly. They both stood in silence, staring at the relic dangling before them. The leather was weathered, sun-cracked, but unmistakable. A horse's bridle, abandoned, forgotten. Yet what truly froze them was what dangled from its straps. A backpack, small, faded, and dust-caked, but still intact. Its color, once bright pink, had dulled to a ghostly hue. One strap was torn, the zipper rusted, and stitched across the front, still legible despite years in the wild, was a name tag, Emily. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, a mocking soundtrack to the discovery. Finally the younger brother whispered, After all these years, the elder swallowed hard. This didn't just wash down here. Creek hasn't run strong enough in years. Someone put it here. The air seemed heavier, the silence suffocating. They exchanged a glance, fear flickering in eyes that had weathered storms, rattlesnakes, and stampedes. But this was something different. This was human. They radioed the sheriff's office, their voices tight, clipped with urgency. Within hours, deputies and forensic teams descended on the site. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, marking the lonely cottonwood as a crime scene. Laura arrived too. She stumbled toward the tree as deputies tried to stop her. Her eyes locked on the backpack and her knees buckled. A raw cry tore from her throat, echoing across the barren creek bed. "That's hers. That's Emily." Sheriff Dalton caught her shoulders, steadying her, his face pale. "Laura, we'll take care of it. You can't be here." She shook her head violently, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. "For 5 years, you told me nothing. Now you tell me I can't be here. That's my daughter's. That's all I have left of her." The forensic team worked with hushed efficiency. Gloves tugged tight, cameras snapping, evidence bags rustling. They lowered the bridle carefully, the leather creaking as though protesting its release. The backpack came last, its weight light but unbearable. Inside they found fragments of childhood. A cracked hairbrush with strands of blonde still tangled in its bristles, a faded notebook, pages curled but legible, and tucked between them, a diary, its cover warped but intact. Laura's breath caught when she saw it. "She always carried that with her," she whispered. "She wrote everything in it." The discovery reignited the town's long-buried fear. At the diner, voices trembled as locals pieced together the implications. "If that backpack sat there for 5 years, someone would have seen it sooner," one man said, shaking his head. "Unless it wasn't there 5 years," another replied grimly, "unless someone just put it there." The thought settled like a shadow over the valley. Because if the backpack had been planted, it meant someone knew exactly what happened to Michael and Emily and had waited years before choosing to remind the world. Back at the sheriff's office, Dalton studied the diary with gloved hands. Its pages told of ordinary teenage days, sketches of horses, notes about chores, dreams of future rides with her father. But the final entries chilled him. Emily's handwriting, shakier than before, recorded something strange. "Dad said someone was following us." Dalton closed the book slowly, his pulse pounding. He looked at his deputy, who stared back wide-eyed. "We've been wrong from the start," Dalton muttered. "This wasn't an accident." That night, Laura sat on her porch, the diary clutched against her chest. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating her gaunt face. For the first time, she felt her grief sharpen into something colder certainty. Michael and Emily hadn't been lost to the land. Someone had taken them, and whoever it was had left her a reminder. The diary sat on the sheriff's desk like a relic, pulled from another world. Its warped cover bore the faint imprint of stickers Emily had once carefully pressed there. Unicorns, a crescent moon, faded stars. For years, Laura had prayed for something, anything, that belonged to her daughter. And now, here it was, weathered but whole, carrying words that felt like a whisper from the grave. Deputies gathered around as Dalton turned the fragile pages with gloved hands. The entries were written in a teenager's hurried scrawl, lines bending upward, ink sometimes smudged. At first the words were innocent, lists of chores, sketches of horses with hearts drawn beside their names, small arguments with her mother written in dramatic strokes. "Mom doesn't get it. Dad says I'll understand when I'm older." Laura, seated in the corner, clutched her knees as the words were read aloud. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not look away. For the first time in years, she was hearing her daughter's voice again. But then the entries shifted. The handwriting grew jagged, the tone more anxious. "Something feels wrong on the trails. Dad says don't worry, but he keeps looking back." Another page, "Horses are nervous too, I can tell." And then the final entry. Short, uneven, a sentence that seemed to bleed fear through the ink. "Dad said someone was following us." The room fell silent. Even the ceiling fan's low hum seemed suddenly loud, intrusive. Deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Dalton closed the diary slowly, as if to trap the words inside. Laura's voice broke the silence. "You see? He knew something was wrong." Dalton hesitated, searching for words. "It doesn't prove who or why, just that they weren't alone." Her reply was fierce. "That's all I've been saying for 5 years." The diary was sent for forensic testing. Analysts examined the ink, confirming it matched the period of their disappearance. Fingerprints, mostly Emily's, dotted the pages, but on the back cover, faint smudges remained, too blurred to identify, but not Emily's. Dalton stared at the report, the words circling in his mind. Another set of hands had touched this diary. The discovery fractured the case wide open. Suddenly, the neat accident theory that had soothed officials and locals alike collapsed. If Michael and Emily had sensed a follower, it meant intent. If someone else had handled the diary, it meant interference. At the diner, townsfolk argued in hushed voices. Could have been a drifter, plenty passed through. But others shook their heads. Drifters don't wait 5 years to leave trophies behind. Whoever did this wanted us to know. Theories multiplied. Some whispered of an obsessed neighbor, others spoke of feuds Michael had with rival ranchers. A few suggested a far stranger explanation, that someone had stalked them for years, waiting for the perfect moment. For Laura, the diary was both salvation and torment. She read it over and over, memorizing every word, as if decoding her daughter's fear might bring her closer. Some nights, she left the book open on the kitchen table, whispering lines aloud. "Dad said someone was following us." The words became a chant, a refrain that both fueled her anger and hollowed her heart. One evening, her sister visited, urging her to stop. "Laura, it'll eat you alive." But Laura shook her head, her voice low and certain. "It already has, and I don't care. This proves they were taken, and I'll find who did it." Investigators returned to the cottonwood, combing the ground around the creek bed with new urgency. Beneath layers of dust and tangled roots, they found subtle marks, tiny cuts along the leather straps of the bridle, the kind no accident would cause, as if someone had sliced it free, deliberately discarding it. Dalton stared at the evidence bag, jaw tight. This wasn't nature," he muttered. "This was done by hand." His deputy swallowed hard. "Then we're dealing with someone who's still out there." The thought spread quickly, chilling the valley once more. Parents pulled children from the trails. Ranchers rode armed, their rifles slung across saddles. The land, once wide open and free, now felt claustrophobic with suspicion. And through it all, Laura remained unyielding. She pressed the diary against her chest, whispering to her daughter's words as if they were a promise. For 5 years, she had been dismissed, pitied, ignored. Now, finally, the land had spoken through Emily's hand. But if Emily's words were true, then somewhere in those plains, a shadow had walked with them. A shadow that still lingered. The discovery of Emily's diary shattered the fragile peace the valley had built over 5 years. It was no longer just an unsolved accident lingering in whispered conversations. It was proof that someone had followed Michael and Emily, proof that another set of hands had touched their belongings, proof that shadows had walked with them into the wilderness. And once proof surfaced, theories old, buried, and dangerous rose with it. At the sheriff's office, Dalton convened his team in the cramped briefing room. Maps of the valley lined the walls, red pins marking the trails where the Hanlons were last seen. The diary lay on the table, its warped cover a reminder that silence no longer protected anyone. Dalton cleared his throat. If someone was following them, then we're looking at foul play. Which means this isn't over. His deputies shifted uncomfortably. They had lived through the case once already. Reopening it meant reopening wounds the community had tried to bury. One deputy finally spoke. "Sheriff, if it was foul play, it had to be someone who knew the land. Someone who could disappear just as clean." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. It could have been one of their own. Whispers reignited in town. At the diner, ranchers leaned across chipped tabletops, muttering about grudges. Michael had feuds, one man said. Disputes over water rights, grazing land. Folks don't forget debts around here. Another shook his head. But killing a man and his daughter? That's not a feud, that's evil. Still, suspicion grew. Some pointed to a drifter seen near the valley that summer. Others recalled a stranger in a beat-up truck asking for directions. But the most unsettling theories were closer to home. A rival rancher, a bitter neighbor, or even someone in law enforcement. Laura faced the rumors head-on. Standing in the aisle of the grocery store, she overheard two women whispering about Michael's debts. Her voice cut sharp through their gossip. "My husband was a good man. Don't you dare suggest otherwise." They fell silent, but their eyes carried the weight of doubt. At night, Laura sat with the diary, tracing the last words over and over. "Dad said someone was following us." Her mind spun with possibilities. A neighbor, a stranger, someone hiding in plain sight? Each theory sharpened her grief into rage. Investigators pursued leads with renewed vigor. A ranch hand came forward, claiming he had seen a lone rider trailing behind Michael and Emily that day. "Didn't think much of it then," he admitted, eyes downcast. "But now, could have been someone watching them." Dalton pressed him for details, but the memory was blurred by years. All he could recall was the figure wore a wide-brimmed hat and rode a dark horse. A description so vague it fit half the valley. Then came a discovery that deepened the mystery. Searchers revisiting an old trail found a fire pit, long buried under dirt and weeds. Within the ashes lay charred bones. At first, panic spread. It might be human remains. But forensic testing revealed the bones were animal, a deer. Yet the way the fire pit had been arranged felt deliberate, almost staged.
"Why burn a deer in the middle of nowhere?"
Dalton asked aloud, staring at the photographs. His deputy answered softly, "Maybe to make it look like something else was burned." The implication hung heavy. Fear crept back into daily life. Parents forbade children from riding out alone. Locks clicked on doors at dusk. The valley, once open and free, now pulsed with suspicion. Every stranger's face was studied too long. Every unexplained sound in the night made hearts race. Laura, meanwhile, grew fiercer. She stood at a town meeting, diary in hand, her voice ringing with fury. "My husband and daughter were taken. Don't tell me it was the river. Don't tell me it was an accident. Someone here knows the truth." Her words silenced the room. For a moment, even those who doubted her felt the sting of guilt. But the most chilling theory came from an old rancher named Silas, who had lived through more tragedies than most. Sitting by a campfire, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "Sometimes folks don't just vanish. Sometimes they're made to vanish. And when that happens, the land doesn't give 'em back, unless the one who took 'em wants it to." The men around him shifted uneasily. No one dared ask who he thought the one might be. Late one evening, Dalton drove the back roads alone, headlights carving tunnels of light through the dark. The diary's words echoed in his mind. Someone was following them. Someone close enough to watch but skilled enough to vanish. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, a knot forming in his gut. For the first time, the sheriff admitted to himself what Laura had known all along: this was never an accident, it was a crime. And crimes, no matter how carefully buried, always leave shadows. The discovery came not with fanfare, but with the faint smell of ash rising from ground that should have been long cold. It was late autumn when a group of deputies, retracing old trails in the foothills, stumbled upon a patch of earth, darker than its surroundings. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just a circle of soil baked hard by years of sun. But when one deputy's boot sank deeper than expected, the ground gave way to charred remains buried beneath. They dug carefully, brushing aside layers of dirt until blackened stones and fragments of bone came into view. The pit was shallow, deliberate, as though someone had tried to erase it, but not too well. The smell of burnt marrow lingered faintly even after all that time, clinging to the wind that carried through the valley. Sheriff Dalton crouched beside the discovery, the weight of 5 years pressing into his shoulders. "Mark it, photograph everything. Don't disturb more than you have to," he ordered, though his voice was strained. The deputies obeyed, gloves pulling fragments from the ash and placing them gently into evidence bags. Among the remains were shards of charred fabric, melted metal buckles, and bones so blackened they crumbled at the touch. Word spread quickly. To the townsfolk, it sounded like the case had finally cracked wide open.
They found a campfire. People whispered in the diner. Bones inside it. Has to be them. Fear sharpened with every retelling. Parents hushed their children. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion.
But when forensic results came back, the truth only deepened the mystery. The bones weren't human. They belonged to a deer, maybe more than one. Dalton read the report aloud in the briefing room, his jaw tightening. Not Michael, not Emily. A deputy frowned. Then why burn it like this? Out here, away from everything? No one answered. But the implication was clear. The fire had been staged. Laura arrived at the site days later, escorted by a deputy despite Dalton's protests. She stood on the ridge, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the blackened circle below. "Someone wanted us to find that," she said softly. The deputy hesitated. "Or someone wanted us to stop looking." Laura's eyes didn't leave the pit. "Then they don't know me at all." Investigators combed the surrounding area with renewed urgency. Metal detectors swept across the soil. Dogs were brought in again, their barks echoing off the canyon walls. For hours they found nothing, until one handler called out. Buried beneath a shallow layer of soil, just beyond the fire pit, lay a rusted horseshoe. The metal was warped, as though exposed to heat. Dalton picked it up, turning it in his hands. "Could be one of theirs," he murmured. Laura, standing nearby, whispered, "Or it could be what's left of their horses." Her words sent a chill through everyone present. Theories erupted again. Some believed the fire pit was meant to destroy evidence, clothing, tack, anything that might identify the Hanlons. Others thought it was a cruel trick, staged to torment those who searched. At the bar, old ranch hands argued over whiskey. "Whoever did this wanted us chasing ghosts," one spat. Another shook his head. "No, whoever did this wanted us to know they were here, and that they're still out there." For Laura, the fire pit marked a breaking point. That night, she collapsed on her porch, clutching Emily's diary in one hand and Michael's jacket in the other. Her sobs carried across the fields, raw and unrestrained. Neighbors heard but did not intervene. They no longer knew what comfort to offer a woman who had lived in grief for half a decade. Through her tears, she whispered to the wind, "I know you saw them. I know you took them. And I'll never stop until I find you." Weeks later, another grim discovery followed. About 7 miles from the fire pit, a rancher stumbled across skeletal remains scattered beneath sagebrush. At first he thought they belonged to cattle lost in a storm, but when deputies examined them, the truth was worse. The bones were equine, a horse, and in the skull, embedded deep near the eye socket, was a rusted bullet. Dalton stared at the X-ray images under fluorescent light. "This wasn't an accident," he said flatly. His deputy nodded, face pale. If the horses were shot, then Michael and Emily never had a chance. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing on every chest. What had once been dismissed as a tragic accident was now undeniably violent. Someone had killed their horses, and once that truth was accepted, the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. If the animals were executed, what fate had befallen the riders? The bullet lodged in the horse's skull changed everything. It was the kind of discovery that shattered denial, stripped away comforting lies, and forced even the most skeptical to face the horror beneath. The Hanlons had not been lost to the wilderness. They had been hunted. In the sterile glow of the county morgue, the skeletal remains lay arranged on a metal table. Forensic lights glinted off fragments of bone, the shattered skull bearing the rusted slug that had rested there for years. Sheriff Dalton stood with arms crossed, his jaw a hard line, as the coroner delivered the findings. "The angle of entry suggests close range," she said quietly. "Execution style. Whoever shot this horse wanted to ensure it never moved again." Dalton swallowed hard. He had seen many crimes in his career, but the brutality of this revelation was different. "If they shot the horses," he muttered, "they didn't leave the riders standing." Back at the sheriff's office, deputies sifted through the fractured pieces of evidence. The bridle, the backpack, the diary, the fire pit, and now the bullet. A grim mosaic began to form. Dalton tapped the table, frustration mounting. It's fragments. Nothing connects clean. But put together, it paints a picture we can't ignore. One deputy leaned forward. Michael was the target. Has to be. Someone wanted him gone. Emily. She was collateral. The words hung in the air like a noose. Laura was brought in to hear the findings. She sat rigid, hands clutching Emily's diary, as Dalton explained. His voice was measured, careful, but the truth was merciless.
They didn't die in an accident, Laura. Someone killed the horses, which means...
Her eyes closed, tears slipping free. Which means they killed my family too. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, in a voice sharpened by grief and rage, she said, "Find them. Whoever did this, find them." Theories resurfaced with sharper edges. Investigators dug into Michael's past, scrutinizing every feud, every grudge. A dispute over grazing rights with a neighboring rancher. An argument at a livestock auction months before. Rumors of unpaid debts whispered in saloons. One name surfaced again and again. A drifter who had worked odd jobs on ranches that summer, known for a violent temper and sudden disappearance after the Hanlons vanished. Deputies tracked him across counties, questioning old employers, chasing paper trails, but the man seemed to have dissolved into the wind. Still, suspicion lingered that the truth was closer, someone who knew the trails, someone familiar with Michael's routines. Dalton visited Silas, the old rancher whose warnings had haunted him for years. They sat on a porch, overlooking fields washed gold by the setting sun. "You ever wonder why the land never gave them back?" Dalton asked. Silas lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like ghosts between them. "Because sometimes the land protects its secrets, not for itself, but for the men who walk it." Dalton studied him. Unsettled. "You think it was one of our own?" Silas didn't answer directly. He only exhaled, the smoke drifting into the dying light. "You already know." Meanwhile, Laura pursued her own truth. She wrote letters to state officials, begged investigative journalists to reopen the case, and even traveled to conferences on missing persons, sharing Emily's story. Each time, she carried the diary, holding it like a sacred text. At one gathering, another mother whose child had vanished took her hands. "The diary is her voice," the woman whispered. "Don't let anyone silence it." Laura nodded, her resolve hardening. "I won't." The valley remained on edge. Every creak of a barn door, every rider seen too late on the horizon, every stranger who lingered too long in town, rekindled suspicion. Parents forbade children from straying out of sight. The freedom of the open land had turned into paranoia, and yet the fragments of truth offered no closure, only deeper dread. The bullet proved violence. The diary proved pursuit. The fire pit proved staging, but none of it revealed who or what. One night, Dalton sat alone in his office, staring at the evidence board. Photographs of Michael and Emily smiled down from their pins, surrounded by scraps of clues like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. He whispered to himself, "We've been chasing ghosts, and maybe the ghost is one of us." When Laura visited him the next morning, her voice was steady despite the torment in her eyes. "Sheriff, I don't care if it takes another 5 years or 10. Don't you dare close this case again. Because the truth is out there, and until you find it, I'll keep reminding everyone." Dalton nodded slowly, knowing she meant every word. But as he watched her leave, he couldn't shake the thought that haunted him most. The land had given fragments, and fragments meant someone out there still held the rest. Someone alive. The case of Michael and Emily Hanlon ended not with resolution, but with echoes. Years had passed since their disappearance, yet the valley remained scarred by their absence. The land was the same windswept plains, rolling hills, the river winding silver through cottonwoods, but for those who remembered, nothing felt untouched. It was as if the earth itself carried the weight of their silence. For Laura, the silence was the cruelest companion. She continued her rituals with unwavering devotion. Every anniversary she drove to the trailhead, her truck rattling along familiar gravel roads. She would step out carrying flowers, the stems wrapped tightly in her hands, and place them at the wooden sign where Michael and Emily had last been seen. She would stand there for hours, her figure small against the endless horizon, as if waiting for the silhouettes of horse and rider to crest the ridge. Neighbors who passed often slowed their trucks, uneasy. They knew the story, every detail etched into their memory. Yet seeing Laura still standing vigil after all these years was a reminder of something none of them could forget, no matter how deeply they tried to bury it. The town, too, carried the shadow. Conversations in the diner still hushed when their names were mentioned. The church bells rang with a weight heavier than their tone. Children grew up hearing the story whispered, as warning. Don't ride too far, don't wander alone, remember what happened to the Hanlon. Ranchers who once scoffed at superstition admitted quietly that the trails felt different now. Like the land's listening, one said, his voice low. Like it remembers. The investigation never closed officially. Sheriff Dalton kept the case file in the top drawer of his desk, reopening it on sleepless nights. He would trace the lines of Emily's final diary entry, stare at the photograph of the rusted bullet, and feel the gnawing weight of unfinished business. Deputies moved on, some retiring, some transferring out of the county, but Dalton never could. One night, staring at the evidence board under the hum of fluorescent lights, he whispered aloud, "I failed you." His voice cracked in the emptiness. There was no reply, only the rustle of wind against the windows. For Laura, grief transformed into a kind of relentless advocacy. She traveled across the state, speaking at conferences for missing persons, holding Emily's diary aloft like scripture. Her voice carried both heartbreak and defiance. "My daughter wrote, 'Dad said someone was following us.' That is her voice. That is her truth, and I will never stop until someone answers for it." The rooms always fell silent when she spoke. Mothers reached for her hand. Fathers stared at the floor. Reporters scribbled her words. But no matter how many ears heard her, no arrests were made, no suspect ever named. The diary itself became a haunting artifact. Laura kept it in a glass case on her mantel, the cracked spine lit by a single lamp each night. Sometimes she would sit across from it in silence, whispering as though Emily could hear. "I still hear you. I still know." Visitors found the sight unsettling. The way the pages seemed to glow faintly under the lamp, the way Laura spoke to it like prayer. But for her, it was not madness. It was connection. The land, too, seemed to hold its own memory. Hikers reported strange unease near the Cottonwood Creek bed where the backpack had been found. Ranchers claimed their horses balked near the ridge where the fire pit lay buried. Some swore they heard faint laughter on the wind, carried from nowhere. Whether superstition or guilt, the story spread, weaving the Hanlons deeper into local legend. But beneath the legends was a harsher truth. Justice never came. The fragments, the diary, the bullet, the fire pit, remained just that. Pieces of a puzzle without a whole picture. And the shadow of the one who had followed Michael and Emily remained unbroken, unpunished, unseen. On the 10th anniversary, Laura returned once more to the trailhead. The sky was a hard blue, the air sharp with autumn's chill. She placed flowers at the post and stood silently. For a long time, nothing stirred. Then, a single gust of wind bent the grass, carrying with it the faint creak of leather as though a saddle shifted unseen.
She closed her eyes, whispering, "I know you're still here."
When she opened them, the plain stretched empty before her, vast and merciless. But in her heart, the truth pressed heavy. The land remembered. And somewhere, buried beneath silence, so did the one who had taken them. The mystery of Michael and Emily Hanlon remained unsolved. Their legacy was not closure, but caution. Not justice, but silence. A silence that seeped into every corner of the valley, binding those who lived there to the unanswered question. Who had followed them into the wild, and why? And would the land ever give up the rest of its secret?